Welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 36, and today we're going to be talking about the assumption you've got to have a system. This is really interesting. We rely on loads of systems to get things done, and actually I've spent a lot of my professional career designing systems and building systems. But there's also an awful lot of blind spots and limitations and some harm through the misuse of systems. And I think it's a really, really interesting thing, particularly when we get attached to the certainty that a system promises. Today's guest is Andrew Hugill. He's composer, musicologist, and creative technologist, and professor of creative computing at the University of Leicester. So welcome to the show, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here.
So first of all, apologies to Andrew, and apologies for anyone who was going to watch this live on Tuesday. This was rescheduled, so it is live, and technical issues came up. Hopefully they're resolved now. So if you happen to be new to the show, Delightful Dissent is an idea that came about through my work with people who are really taking a different approach and making their own way in doing things kind of really quite differently to the mainstream. I think Andrew is one of those people. That's why I wanted to speak to him, partly why I wanted to get him on the show. But I often find that in this space, the hidden barriers, the implicit beliefs, the kind of deep, unquestioned assumptions are the things that really cause issues for this work. And this is a show about surfacing them, examining them, playing with them. So hopefully it will give you a chance to go to really, find some specific assumptions, learn something today specifically, but perhaps more importantly, it'll give you some ideas about how you can go out and challenge the assumptions that are really causing limits for you yourself. Because ultimately, I'd like to see everyone be able to do this work and not just be a kind of privileged few who get to kind of call out stuff that doesn't work for them. So is the other thing I like to do with the show is really to give an example of a real exploratory conversation. There's an awful lot online of very glossy kind of finished content. This is about exploring and kind of challenging and seeing where we go with something. And it's called Delightful Dissent because, we are challenging something. You know, we are saying, okay, this way of thinking about the world isn't perfect, isn't complete. But it's not about proving ourselves completely right and kind of winning and proving the other side wrong. It's about exploring the different approaches and playing with what is, and really, not doing so in a happy and joyful way instead of a way that feels like a huge argument. So this show is genuinely live. There may be challenging personal topics that come up in this episode. We're going to be talking about potentially talking about neurodivergence. So if there's anything in that space that is potentially an issue for you, then please do know that that's coming up. We may also use strong language. So again, if that's an issue for you, then please do know that that's potentially coming up. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about asking questions of yourself and questions of us as well. If you're watching live, please do ask questions in the chat and we will bring them in and be able to discuss them. If you're watching the recording or listening to the recording, then you can find our contact details at the end of the show. We'll be sharing how to get in touch with us at the end of the show if you do have any further questions. So I first came across Andrew's work and I was really struck by such a really rich and unexpected intersection of ideas and areas, and one that I found particularly appealing because it kind of ticked a lot of boxes for me. It was something that was a lot of areas that I'm interested in too, and I really wanted to get him on this show. And when we spoke, I was struck by really the breadth of his knowledge, but also his ability to link those different areas together in really interesting and exciting ways. So I did really, that's why I particularly wanted him on the show. I think that's probably enough of me talking. So Andrew, could I ask you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, perhaps describe your work and talk about the people that you work with?
Sure. So I'm a composer and a musicologist and a creative technologist. My job title is Professor of Creative Computing at the University of Leicester. I'm semi-retired now, so I'm actually part-time there. But creative computing really sums up quite a lot of what we're talking about today, because it's, on the one hand, you've got the ultimate systemizing machine, the computer, and on the other hand, you've got creativity, which is that human spark, that thing, certain indefinable thing, and we can talk about what happens when those two areas collide, and that's the area I inhabit, really, is on the one hand of the objective system, and on the other hand the subjective realities, the subjective view of things. So my background is that, when I was young, I got very interested in music and computing. Having been diagnosed autistic, 2018, I look back on that now and realise that, of course, this was very typical for autistic people. If you read the accounts of autism, often music and computing are two of the things that autistic people tend to be very interested in. So I remember programming the local mainframe. I mean, in those days, this was the 1970s. There were hardly any computers in the country. The only ones were great big things in universities. So as a schoolboy, it was quite hard to get access to this, but I managed to get access, and they ran a cricket scoring program for me. I was the scorer for the school cricket team. I could never play cricket. I was terrible at it, but I quite liked the game, and I enjoyed the scoring. Another sort of systematizing aspect. So that was exciting, and I kind of continued to work with computers off and on through my career, whilst at the same time composing a lot for acoustic instruments and so on. So I was writing some digital music, as we call it now, or computer music, even in the 1980s. I worked with a thing called the Fairlight computer, which was one of the earliest music computers. But at the same time, I wrote a lot of more conventional music for instruments, including a symphony and some large choral compositions and lots of other stuff like that. Got a lot of BBC commissions, and works got performed around the world and continue to be performed. And then also I became an academic. So that started in 1986, and I began teaching in a music department, and then eventually set up a thing called the Institute of Creative Technologies. And again, this comes back to what we're talking about today. This was a research institute with a very large budget, where you could only work in the institute if you collaborated with someone from a different discipline. So the idea was to force collaborations, and some of these collaborations could be quite extreme. Poets working with engineers and that kind of thing. So that was very exciting and interesting. And then eventually I moved to the University of Leicester, where I was asked to set up this new subject area called creative computing, which I've done quite a bit to theorize as well. The other sort of slightly wackier aspect of my interest is pataphysics, and we can perhaps talk a bit about that later on as well. This is essentially a French sort of pseudo-philosophy, but it really provided me with quite a useful way of framing this divergent thinking. So until I realized that I was autistic, or became diagnosed as autistic, the way I thought and the way I experienced the world, I had to find ways to sort of understand that. And pataphysics helped me in that respect.
That's wonderful. Thank you. There's so much interesting in there. I'm really, really looking forward to getting into that whole thing. And it's so interesting as I reflect. For me personally, there's that strange collision space. I think I really like the description between the kind of objective, kind of formal systems, and then the kind of subjective creativity and the experiential is such an interesting and rich space to be in. So yeah, I think as you said that, it really made me think, yeah, that's I something I've experienced and is quite unexpected for many people and quite challenging for many people.
Well, I remember many years ago, very many years ago now, I did a PhD in composition. So, you know, I submitted a portfolio of composed works, and I found myself, because when you do a creative PhD, you have to write an accompanying thesis that explains the portfolio. It's not enough just to submit a load of composition. You actually have to sort of show how it's research and, you know, what's going on in this work. So I came up against this problem, which was how to describe things where there was no obvious system at work. So, you know, how to describe those moments which most people will call just instinct. The moments where you just did something because it felt right, you know. So I chose this chord as opposed to that chord because at that moment I like that chord better than that chord, you know. And there was no obvious system that I could use to explain that decision. And composing is essentially decision making. I mean, that's all it is. You just make lots and lots of decisions all the time. So I came up with this phrase, non-systematized thinking. And I used that in the thesis to describe these moments when, you know, I just couldn't really explain why I made this particular choice, but that seemed to be the right choice to make. And I quite liked that at the time, and certainly the examiners liked it. They thought it was a good way of getting out of a hole, basically. But you know, as the years have gone by, I've become less and less convinced by it. And the reason is that I think that there's always some kind of system at work, you know. And the fact that I can't explain it or articulate it doesn't mean it's not there, you know. And so I think I've become more and more aware that, you know, instincts that, I mean, it's not like I don't believe in instinct. I mean, I think there are instincts, you know, deep buried human instincts, like, you know, the instinct to be alarmed if a sound happens behind you. You know, I think that goes back to just self-preservation, you know, around the watering hole. If you heard a sound behind you, that was probably going to be something that you didn't want to encounter, you know. So there are instinctual responses like that. But in terms of something like composing music, I don't really buy the idea of instinct. I think there is always some kind of systemizing force at work, even if you can't necessarily explain what it is or understand it, or indeed want to explain it. A lot of people don't want to talk about this kind of thing because it gets in the way of what they would regard as kind of pure inspiration. I've got a lot of sympathy for that, but at the same time, the trouble with that model is that art is so full of technique, particularly music. You know, it's actually what seems natural and seems instinctual often isn't. It's just the product of a lot of technique.
I think this is one of the really interesting things about, you know, any highly practiced performance has this kind of almost automatic quality about it, certainly non-conscious. You know, any skilled performer isn't consciously controlling their movement, and if you try, it very often gets deeply in the way. I play the drums, and I know if I think about it, I'll get in an awful muddle and my arms will get crossed over and I'll just lose the beat. And you can't actually use the conscious, but yet it is somehow the result of conscious practice.
This idea of flow starts to come in. You know, and there's an interesting overlap here with autism, I think. See, this has been theorized a lot, this notion of flow. That flow is that moment when you're entirely absorbed in what you're doing, to the point that you're unaware of anything else, and you're in that moment, in that flow. And this is often described in relation to music, because musicians tend to get into that state when they're making music. You know, the music acquires a life of its own, and you become a sort of almost like as Stravinsky put it, a vessel through which the music passes. You know, but what I always found odd about this idea of flow and here's a bit of delightful dissent, was that to me it just seemed normal. And I was like, well, what's so special about this? This is what I do all the time, you know. And of course, it's only since being diagnosed autistic that I realised that actually this is what autistic theorists call hyperfocus. It's the same thing, you know. So autistic people become obsessed, often with systematizing. So when I was a child, for example, I used to line up bricks, coloured bricks, in an order, or toy cars. I can still remember the configurations, you know. So you start to observe patterns, and you become very, very fascinated with those patterns. And I think this is the same thing as what theorists call flow. And I think for neurotypical people, this is an extraordinary condition to get into, you know, the state of flow. For autistic people, I think it's the norm. And actually, it's the opposite that's extraordinary, is getting out of a flow state into some kind of general state where you're not really absorbed in anything. You know, that's quite hard for me to do.
It's a really interesting one, because obviously ADHD is also associated with hyperfocus, and I think there's something really. I'm not sure whether I think of them as related. I'm not sure. This is one of the huge difficulties of not being able to experience anyone else's conscious awareness, is that, but as I do not think I experience, my hyperfocus feels slightly different to a conventional flow state. And I think I have access to both sometimes, though flow not quite as often. For me, hyperfocus is helpful a lot of the time, but is associated with a huge amount of discomfort when it's broken. And I'm not sure flow is. And I think that might be the difference. Otherwise, they feel very, very similar. But it's I don't know if this is common to your experience, but for me, if I'm hyper-focused, anything that breaks that awareness, that it's the act of breaking it. First of all, it's gone when it's gone. And second of all, it feels horrible. It feels really uncomfortable. And I think that doesn't seem to be a feature of flow in the wider that I've come across quite as much in documentation.
I don't know. I recognise the same thing, yeah. You mean by broken? You mean interrupted? So,
yes.
So it breaks the state. Yeah, no,
breaks the spell. Yeah,
yeah. I have exactly the same sense of irritation and frustration when that happens. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe they are different things. I'm not entirely sure. But all I can say is, when I read the descriptions of flow by the theorists, they seem remarkably similar to the state I'm in most of the time.
Absolutely. I think it's almost the same state. I'm just not entirely sure it's exactly the same. And which I think perfectly brings us to the to the assumption at hand, and the idea you've got to have a system, and the effects of systematizing experience in this way is it's hugely helpful to have the words, but exactly where they line up and where they don't with each of our different experiences is a really interesting thing. And I'd like to ask my guests to bring a quote before we kind of really get into things. Though we have got into things a little bit, which is really, really good. Yeah, if you've got, have you got a quote you'd like to share with us?
So I brought along this quote from Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. And he wrote a story called The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. And in that story, he describes what he calls a certain Chinese encyclopedia, the celestial emporium of benevolent knowledge. And in this book, it is written that animals are divided into these categories, and I'll read them out. So this is the taxonomy of animals in the celestial emporium of benevolent knowledge. So they are those that belong to the emperor, embalmed ones, those that are trained, suckling pigs, mermaids, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those included in the present classification, those that tremble as if they were mad, innumerable ones, those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, others, those that have just broken of a flower vase, and those that from a long way off look like flies. And I thought as an example of how my kind of systematizing works, that it doesn't get much better than that, really.
I love it. Yeah, I think what's fascinating for me listening to that is that whilst I'm listening, I can feel my brain trying to fit things into those categories, even though I know it's completely kind of, made up as a, and is in a sense is a, is humorous. But it's amazing how even knowing all of that, my brain's like, oh yeah, and that, and actually is trying to systematize using that just at the mere mention of it.
Yes, I mean, it's poetic, but it also, as you suggest, has elements of rigor to it. Those that are included in the present classification and others, these seem to me quite neutral, but all-encompassing categories. So basically, it's everything that's in this classification and everything that isn't.
And what's interesting is it has overlapping categories. And I think that's always it has multiple layers and kind of sets and subsets. And that as a, as a taxonomy is a really interesting, again, it opens up the possibility of paradox and strange edges and things that whenever you have things that are and things that are not in the same set of categories, you introduce the possibility of kind of strange paradoxes.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I worked with a computer scientist called Jim Hendler, who is very well known. He was one of the people with Tim Berners-Lee who created the Semantic Web, which is basically the way the web is now. And he and I worked on a new search engine. We were trying to create a search engine which we called the syzygy surfer. A syzygy is like an eclipse. It's when things come into alignment unexpectedly.
An alignment of the planets, I guess. Would
be a good example of a syzygy. It's a univocalic word, syzygy, which immediately is attractive in my world. Anyway, we kind of use this taxonomy as the starting point for it. What we were trying to do was to create the kind of anti-Google. So the way Google has become now is, it takes you ever closer to what you want. So you go to a search engine to find something that you want, and the system drives you to that thing as quickly as possible and as accurately as possible. And a measure of its success is, how accurate it was. And of course, sometimes it's not as accurate as you think it ought to be, but a lot of the time it's pretty accurate. What we want to do is to do the kind of the opposite, really, which is to, when searching for something, to take you to a place that you didn't realize you wanted to go to, but when you get there, you're glad you arrived. So it's how could we harness the system of the web to drive the user to a more poetic state, and that's why we called it a surfer, because it was a bit like the old idea of surfing, which was prevalent at the beginning of the web, when there was this sense of the unexpected and danger. You needed a certain skill to navigate the World Wide Web, and you would keep coming across stuff that was really horrible and you did wish you hadn't seen, or you made mistakes, or it just didn't work. That happened a lot in the early days. But the idea of surfing has really gone now because everything's so predictable. So we wanted to try and recapture that spirit. And we built this search engine that uses pataphysical principles to tie together. Well, there are basically three things that it operates with. One is the syzygy, which I've already explained. Another is called the clinomen, which is clinamen, which actually is a very ancient idea. It goes back to Epicurus. The idea of a slight deviation. So you have something that's going in a predictable path, and you just make a slight deviation. which in web terms might be just changing one letter or changing slightly the meaning, and it just makes the thing veer off in a different way, often colliding with other things and creating new things. And then the third thing is a much more familiar idea, which is the anomaly, the thing that doesn't fit. So working with contradictions and exceptions, basically. And so that, and to do that, we used the metadata that is available on the web. So, most sites now have loads of metadata attached. And the thing about metadata, actually, there's a theorist, Cory Doctorow, who wrote a text called the meta-crap thesis. Sorry for the strong language enthusiasts out there. The meta-crap thesis, which basically said the problem with metadata is that it's riddled with errors, where people are stupid. There are all sorts of. It gives about a dozen different reasons why metadata is terrible. Will always give bad results. So we kind of use that. We sort of thought, okay, well that's interesting because that will then introduce some clinomen into the predictability. So we started to use this meta crap, to try and develop something new, and we called it patadata after pataphysics. Pataphysics is to metaphysics as metaphysics is to physics. That's how so physics looks at the laws of the universe, the matter. Metaphysics looks at everything that doesn't exist, basically, God, ghosts, that kind of thing.
The laws that govern the laws of the universe.
The unknowable things that lie beyond that. Patadata stands in the same relationship to metadata as metadata stands to data. If data is the stuff of the web, metadata is the stuff written about the stuff of the web, and patadata is the stuff that uses the metadata to take you somewhere else. That was the thinking. And we built this thing, and people have used it. It does have some practical application, but I think it's more the spirit of it that operates more than the actuality, if that makes sense.
It's a very interesting thing, and to formalize, to explore, because I suspect quite a lot of cognition is actually, we all humans have quite highly faulty from a deterministic perspective cognition. We assume we know more than we do, and the brain kind of fills in an awful lot of gaps for us. I think perhaps those of us who are neurodivergent understand that in stronger terms because our gaps fall in slightly different places, so they get called out more. But really, the extent to which we are kind of dealing with, we're summarizing and making very quick decisions on quite poor data quite a lot of the time. And I suspect an awful lot of positive serendipity actually arises as a result of that. So it's a fascinating thing to explore and to actually formalize. The other thing that really jumps out at me in that is the idea of the phrase, the word neurodivergent, and its relationship to the concept of a clinomen. And I think there's something really interesting in that, and I've often used that, the divergence, the divergent thinking as an important and powerful quality that some people possess in abundance. Yeah. And being able to use that well as a skill is it's not something that's very often educated or trained. And I think we have to, as a result, we often have to cultivate it ourselves. I'm not sure that's because it's impossible to, but it's certainly not something that's done very often.
It's certainly not impossible to, but the problem is that people tend to assume that it's not worth doing. They either think it's ridiculous or it's unproductive. So, for example, quite often I do an exercise where I navigate a city using a map of another city. I did it in Birmingham a couple of years ago. I thought, well, I'll go and there was a statue in Paris that I wanted to look at, but I was in Birmingham. So I got the map of Paris and I walked down following the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and then turned left to see this statue. And there, just outside Birmingham New Street Station, was a yellow traffic cone in the middle of the road. So I photographed that, and that was the statue, and I posted that on social media, And this is sort of divergent game playing. You talk about delightful dissent, So just taking things that use things not necessarily in the way for which they were originally intended, and just sort of turning them around a bit, And there are loads and loads of ways of doing this kind of thing. It's not like it's massively difficult or highly intellectual, but often people just think it's mickey taking or messing about, And I find quite the reverse. The messing about is the most productive thing, and it's when it gets serious that it tends to not be very productive.
I think it's that we live in a world that emphasizes efficiency over effectiveness. And I think this play actually tends to deliver effectiveness over efficiency, and it's not something. It's something that scares people. Honestly, I think there's a collective fear that we should all be doing something immediately and obviously and straightforwardly productive all the time, which is in itself an interesting paradox if you sit with it for a little while. But I guess if you're in that mode, you would never sit with it for a little while. So,
well, the irony is that these things that I'm talking about are highly productive, but they're not productive in the way that
directly productive in that sense. Yeah,
they're not convergent in that sense. They don't take an idea and find a solution to it, or one solution or two solutions possibly. They take the idea as a starting point and move away from it, and diverge from it. And that's to me is the essence of creativity. It's divergent thinking. So we're back to neurodivergence again. You see, I mean, what I find interesting, because that idea of convergent and divergent thinking is a very old idea in psychology. There's been numerous books and papers written about it over, I think it first arose in the 1950s or 60s. The idea that there's convergent and divergent thinking. But what I find interesting is we use this word neurodivergent. So it's like the neurodivergent people are already hardwired to be divergent thinkers by definition.
One of the ways I think about it is businesses spend millions and millions of pounds educating their staff to think outside the box.
Yeah.
I don't have a box. That's always been part of the problem. I've never perceived the box in the first place.
Exactly, and but I don't think that means that only neurodivergent people can think divergently. I think, but you can do things to encourage this kind of way of thinking. You can play little games that just set people thinking, almost like games of consequences. The surrealists used to do this a lot. They play these games, and it just kind of sometimes makes you laugh, sometimes makes you think, well, what was the point of that? But often the point emerges later. My book, the title of one of my books is Pataphysics: A Useless Guide, and I really wanted to make the point that having a guide to pataphysics is completely useless. You don't, usefulness is the last criterion, and yet when you read any definition of creativity, it always includes the words useful. It says the ideas have to be novel and useful. And you think, well, why does creativity have to be useful? I don't. And then what do we mean by useful anyway?
Novel as well is a word I use a lot, and I think no one's actually held me to account around what I mean by it, and I think if they did, I would struggle. One thing that perhaps feels related actually is I've always with the convergence divergence thing, I pondered this for a little while, because for me that implies a relative state. You can't converge or diverge in absolute terms. You have to converge or diverge relative to something else. It doesn't make sense to, and I think for me, one of the interesting things around perhaps this novelty in creativity feels related to something that is convergent from an existing kind of direction of thought, an existing kind of narrative. Divergent to an existing narrative, but perhaps that converges with others in different ways. And I think, when we're talking about, because ultimately it feels like there's something interesting. One of the really interesting things following neurology and following computer science and following psychology is, and also following kind of experiential practices and meditative practices, is how actually there's quite a lot converging on some core ideas, but they are all diverging from from the kind of existing stories, the existing paradigms within those fields. So I think where you are, one of the questions is, what are you, rather than saying something is purely divergent or purely convergent, it's really important to say what it is diverging or convert from or diverging with. And I think we often overlook that with a kind of assumption of a norm, assumption of a world, and everyone has their assumption of a world. And I think actually one of the interesting things about being neurodivergent, I think, is that your assumption of that gets challenged more often than other people. So you become more aware of it than perhaps some other people do. But I want to say to everyone listening, whether neurodivergent or not, you do have your own specific personal ontology that isn't shared with other people.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is neurodiversity. There's a lot of confusion around at the moment about this word neurodiversity and neurodivergent. Neurodiversity is like biodiversity. It just describes the condition of any group. You put any group of people together, they're neurodiverse because everybody's brain is slightly different to everybody else's. Neurodivergence it refers to specific conditions that really do, position you in a way where your brain, is, as it were, completely differently configured, like autism or ADHD, come to that. But there's always neurodiversity with any group of people. You're always going to find differences between people. If you didn't, the world would be a very strange place.
I'm sure it would be a very functional place. Interestingly, I mean, I think we'd struggle in all sorts of ways. But for me, I think, sorry,
people are using neurodiversity as a sort of shorthand for neurodivergence at the moment.
Yeah.
So in a lot of EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion discussions, neurodiversity is just used to cover autism and perhaps a few other conditions. But it's neurodiversity describes everybody. And you want a healthy neurodiversity in any situation, particularly if you're working in some kind of organization or some kind of joint project. A good neurodiversity is going to lead to better results, almost by definition. Yeah.
Absolutely. The more perspectives on a complex problem, the more readily solved that problem will be. And I think that's so important to state. That one of the, I suspect, insight experiences and creativity are quite closely related. That ability to kind of move around a problem and step outside it, that flexibility of thought in that sense, or flexibility of the models that you're adopting, is hugely important in this work.
Yeah, I think to sort of pull this back to our topic, the autistic brain tends to have often a systematizing tendency. There's a natural inclination to systematize. I don't think that's true for everybody, and we have to be careful. I certainly don't speak on behalf of all autistic people. As somebody once famously said, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. But on the other hand, I do observe in myself this tendency to systematize. But of course, there's more to it, as you said, than simply being systematic about things. That actually the way that system is implemented, and then what you do with it, how you play with it, or like the Borges, how it distorts our idea of what a system should be, can often be the key to it. And certainly when you're dealing with interdisciplinary work, this is really important, because of course, one of the challenges of working across disciplines is that the people from the other discipline don't have the same level of depth of expertise that you have in your discipline. If you're a professor, the traditional route to being a professor is you increasingly specialized knowledge and depth of knowledge in a particular field, and a subfield of a subfield of a subfield of a subfield. Until the only thing that distinguishes you from the professor next door is, you've got a slightly different knowledge of one aspect of one tiny part of the this is why so many professors are autistic. I think they love going into that kind of level of detail. But at the same time, if you're going to get them to collaborate, quite clearly you can't expect somebody who hasn't got that level of knowledge to talk in the same way, or be able to, somehow by osmosis understand all of that stuff. So you have to find a way of allowing the cross-disciplinary partners to engage with one another. And often there's some kind of jointly shared systemic approach to this, a bit like the Borges, where you often come up with a system that doesn't really work as a system, but enables both parties to share a common understanding.
I think that common understanding is a really, really important point, and feels like actually part of this work. We all have, each kind of area of study has its own ontology, its own worldview, its own underpinning assumptions about the way the world is. That all of that really kind of deep work that derives from those assumptions many layers down, and different disciplines start with different assumptions. And so that, like, there are fundamental contradictions that you can kind of crash into in that space. And I think how to do that, I was going to say productively, but I'm not sure that's actually what I mean.
Let me tell you about the project that I'm currently leading. This is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's called Neurodiversity. That's AURAL. And this is really founded on what we're talking about. So any book on music or sound, any discipline that works with sound and music, like acoustics, like urban design, like music, like audiology, hearing science, all these disciplines share a common tacit assumption, which is that the listener is possessed of a perfectly normal functioning pair of equally balanced ears. Yeah, this is just endemic in everything that's written about sound. And of course, the reality is the exact opposite of that. Everybody hears differently. Why does everybody hear differently? Because our ears are uniquely shaped. Every person's ears is individual to them. The pinna, this part of the ear, is like a fingerprint. It's unique. You hear differently at different times of your life. So a child or even a fetus hears very differently to a teenager, for example. And then once we get past the age of about 19, our hearing starts to decline. Everybody experiences this, but everybody's hearing declines at different rates. It's called presbycusis, and it's just a fact of life. That's what happens. So there is a very short period of time, actually, when the majority of people have equally normal hearing and balanced ears. And then, of course, about a sixth of the world's population has some kind of hearing condition, ranging from profound congenital deafness through to tinnitus or perceptual, processing, auditory processing disorders like hyperacusis, where certain sounds are too much. Think of a child being overwhelmed by the sound of a hand dryer in the toilet, for example. That's That's an example of hyperacusis. Lots of autistic people, myself included, have that.
Me too.
And ADHD as well. And there are many different hearing conditions. And the Aural Diversity Project is basically about, first of all, acknowledging the existence of all this different hearing, and then asking some questions then about what this means for various disciplines. With the music, with the project I'm doing, we're focusing mainly on music and soundscape, and acoustic environments. But we've also involved audiologists and hearing scientists and engineers and acousticians. And we're talking to people like DEFRA, the Noise Abatement Society, Royal National Institute for the Blind, and the Royal National Institute for the Deaf, and many more. So there's, and the NHS as well. So there's a lot of interest in this idea that, oh, hang on a minute, maybe audiometric testing, such as is done by audiologists, is founded on a set of assumptions that just aren't representative of the real world. Same with the design of audio equipment, headphones, for example, or loudspeakers, or you go to a concert and there's an assumption that you somehow, everybody listens in the same way. And if you can't listen in that way, then it's up to you to kind of adapt to the situation. You've got to wear some hearing aids, or you've got to, do something to cope with the situation. And to me, this is the wrong way around. Music is a fluid art form. It should adapt to people rather than people having to adapt to music. And so what I want is music that configures itself to suit the listener, not the listener having to sort of somehow acquire some apparatus to be able to engage with the music. And then you look at the way music's taught, oral skills. These are fundamental in music colleges and so on. Oral skills involving, the ability to listen to, for example, pitches and rhythms, and identify them accurately and so on, reproduce melodies and so on. Takes no account whatsoever of differences in hearing. So if you arrive at a music college and you can't hear properly, then you're in difficulties. Likewise for professional musicians, and there've been a few movies about this recently, professional musicians who lose their hearing, often as a result of their work, end up having to keep this a secret because for fear of, being completely made redundant. And of course this is wrong, people hear differently anyway. So, yeah, this raises a whole set of, this is what I mean. What I mean by a tacit assumption that underpins a discipline. This tacit assumption that everybody hears the same, and everybody doesn't.
I really like that to create a project that's challenging that assumption, but on quite an experiential, practical level. I think this is one of the really interesting things about that the domain of work that's kind of creative and arts orientated is its value in setting us outside of our standard perceptual framework, whatever that is, and giving us the experience that someone else might experience the world in a slightly different way, which is so hugely valuable for our own thinking because it allows us access to other models and other ways of thinking. I don't know if anyone else. I listening to music is if I'm stuck on a problem, listening to music and not thinking about that problem is usually one of the quickest ways for me to solve it. And I suspect that's partly because it lets the unconscious mind go and do things, but it's also partly because that unconscious mind is engaging with a way of understanding the world that I don't actually have internally in quite the same way. And I think that is so hugely valuable. And I think for me, that particularly the assumption that once something is mechanically inside the head, it is treated the same way. Once sensory data is in, it's the same, is also such a deeply flawed assumption. I'm auditory tactile synesthetic as well as all the other things. So I have I feel the texture of sound is the best way I can describe it. It's a strange, it's a very strange experience, and it's actually something that's very hard to convey. So yeah, so the idea that even once it's in, it's processed in the same way, if we're using that metaphor, isn't actually well founded, and then it can be expressed very differently too. So you've got this kind of difference in mechanical input, difference in inward kind of sensing and making sense of, summarizing, working with, and then difference in being able to respond and articulate and do something with it, and that all of those can be different. So the idea that we can stick with any one is a really fascinating one. I think for me the other side that comes up is the activeness of listening, and that I know for some people who create stuff, that's actually quite a challenge. They want to induce a specific experience for people. And I think I'd be really interested to know, actually, as a composer, how do you feel about how much control or influence you have over someone else's experience of your work?
Yeah, well, that's a really a really fascinating question, and quite hard to answer. I mean, like you, I'm also synesthetic, and I was commissioned by the BBC to write 7 new compositions recently, which I call Spectrum Sounds. And each of these pieces, they're only short; they're like 3.5 minutes each. Each of these pieces is written in a colour of the spectrum. People can find this online if they want to look it up. It was broadcast on Radio 3 last weekend. So, of course, the question there is, I'm writing, let's say, a blue piece. Okay, so for me, the sound of a trumpet playing an F sharp is blue. That's the colour that I get. Similarly, the sound of wind blowing through holes in the ice in the Arctic is blue. Now, that kind of makes more sense, because if you look at ice in the Arctic, it's got a bluish colour to it, so you can sort of see the connection there. So I wrote a piece for the sound of wind blowing through the ice holes in the Arctic and trumpet, and that's the blue piece. So people listen to that. Now, do the people who are listening to it see blue? I very much doubt it. Even other synesthetes may not see the same colours that I do. So clearly, on one level, this is a hopeless endeavour if my idea is to give everybody the colour blue. But I'm not sure that is the idea, really. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect people to experience the blue that I experience. And hopefully what I'm creating is some music that they can enjoy anyway, without needing to experience blue, and can perhaps enjoy it without even knowing that it was a blue piece in the first place. They just hear this interesting piece for wind and trumpets, and think, oh, great piece, and that's enough, really. At which point I've got really no control over what the listener's doing with the music, and that is really up to the listener. But at the same time, I also produce the 2 other versions of these pieces. So one is what I call evocative transcriptions, and these are basically video expressions of the music. So they're designed for people who cannot listen with cochlea. So they might be able to listen in other ways, but not necessarily in the conventional way through the ear. So they both convey the music and analyze it. I mean, you can have the sound on whilst you're watching these videos. So for people who listen in the normal way, you can just enjoy them as music videos, if you like. But for people who don't listen that way, it gives another way of conveying the musical idea. And there, I think, probably there is rather more control over the way the audience react, in that, I can put the colour blue on screen and it looks blue. So, unless you're colourblind, that's an obvious sort of message. And then the third way I've done it is I've used an experimental technology called audio orchestra. This has been created by the BBC's R&D team as part of a package called MakerBox, which are just a set of creative tools, basically. They're free, anybody can use them. But I work with the BBC on this. And the idea of this audio orchestrator is that you can connect up mobile devices to your computer. So you can have, I say you should have 3 or more. So you can have as many as 7 or 8 if you wish. And then, of course, because you've connected these devices up, you can put them anywhere you like. And so you create a kind of immersive sound world, and then the music adapts to your listening environment. So it will play back across all these devices and give you a sort of a surround experience. And for people like me, see, I mean, my hearing is very badly compromised. So in my right ear, I've got really no hearing at all, or very little. In my left ear, I have some normal hearing, but an awful lot of loss, mostly in the bass frequencies. So what this means for spatial experiences is I can't detect the direction of sound. So I can't, if a sound's playing on my right, it sounds like it's coming from the left because my right ear basically doesn't pick it up, but there's a delay on the sound because of the room environment, etc. So what I can do with this audio orchestrator is I can position all the devices on the left. Now I can get a spatial sense of motion, where there's motion in the sound, because there's quite a bit of movement in what I've composed. I can get that spatial sense of moving around from left to right or whatever, up and down, which is great. But also, from an autistic point of view, I can control the listening experience much better generally, and with that, so I really like that system, and I'm planning to do some more work with it in the future. Specifically looking at neurodivergent musicians. The musicians I work with on Spectrum Sounds were all either had hearing loss or were neurodivergent, or both. Although we did have one musician who was our token neurotypical with no hearing loss.
It's so funny thinking about creating a lot of these spaces is so often we do end up having a token neurotypical.
So yeah, I mean, so to me, this is, again, it's an interesting way of, introducing a variation in the system. So normally you would expect with any kind of piece of broadcast music, you'd have 2 earpieces in, or you'd have a pair of headphones or a pair of speakers, and it would play back through those, and then there would be an experience that's been engineered for you. So you'd receive that experience. So if the sound moves from left to right across the stereo image, that's been worked out by the composer or the engineer. And here you have a completely different way of experiencing the music. That to some extent the control is in your hands. You can decide where to put things, what comes through which speaker. So it changes the nature of the system and makes it more subjective. And I guess this ties right back to the beginning of our conversation about the objective and the subjective, and the objective nature of computers and the subjective ambiguities of humans. This in computer science, or in the web certainly, you come across this phrase disambiguation. And what it's about is getting to the point where the computer can understand what you mean by something. So, the problem is with words is that they have more than one meaning, or many of them do. And so for the computer, this is really difficult because it's basically the same keystrokes, but they have 2 different meanings. So how do you distinguish between the 2 meanings? So you have to disambiguate, and there are various technical ways of doing that, which we won't bore ourselves with. But basically, this is what a lot of artificial intelligence, the web, and everything is devoted to, is disambiguating. And to me, humans are the thing we have is ambiguity. We enjoy things that have more than one meaning. We actually like that plurality of possibilities, that ambiguity. This is a strong aspect of our subjectivity, really. It seems to me, is the ability to interpret and to come up with our own meanings, perhaps. But a computer can't really do that. It needs to know specifically what you mean. So a lot of my playing is in under the bonnet with computers, is to basically screw up the computer's reasoning, to find ways of making it ambiguate rather than disambiguate. So I'm kind of reverse engineering computers to make them more ambiguous. The great hope at the moment is quantum computing, because that cannot calculate anything correctly at the moment. I saw a paper the other day where it said, well, we can get seven times 7, we can get the correct result about 40% of the time, with a quantum.
Which sounds a bit like me. I too completely share the excitement around quantum computing for that very reason, for this space of ambiguity and complexity as a different way of thinking about the world. I absolutely love that. I think.
Have you tried to program a quantum computer?
Sorry?
Have you tried to program a quantum computer?
No, I haven't.
If you go to the IBM website, you can do it for free online.
Cool.
You can actually program their computer. The only results you'll ever get from it are 1 or 0. That's all it can deliver. But the programming environment that you use is exactly like music. It's a 5-line stave, and the five lines represents the state of each of the qubits. That's the bits in the computer, and then you put you drag and drop operators onto these 5 lines, which change the behavior of the qubits, you see. So it looks like old style plainsong notation. That kind of what they used to call pneumatic or neumes, the old sort of squares and flagged notes and all that. It looks remarkably like that. And I just, even if you haven't got a clue what you're doing, because frankly, unless you're a physicist, you haven't really got a hope in hell of understanding half this stuff. But it doesn't matter, you just go along there and drag and drop these attractive flags and see what happens. And basically it'll run your program and then say 1 or 0.
I love that. I think I like to try and kind of bring this, start to wrap it up now, but as a single piece of advice, that whole approach to pretty much anything computational, particularly stuff that results in kind of, it's like, am I doing it right? I think that fear of doing it right holds so many people back, and the invitation, with so many of the projects you've shared and anything else, the creation of music or anything else, is drag and drop the bits and see what happens. What's the worst that can happen?
The great thing about quantum anything is that nobody knows whether they're doing it right or not. Even physicists haven't got a clue. So it's fine, don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love it. So do go out and play that. And then I think you've shared a fair few of your projects. We've got a link to your website in the show notes. So if anyone wants to follow up anything there, they can do. But yeah, that's is there anything else though specifically? I think we've mentioned quite a few of the projects, but is there anything else you'd like to bring in or mention right now that you think might be useful?
So Spectrum Sounds is BBC Commission. Neurodiversity is the big HRC project that I'm leading, and I mentioned pataphysics and the book. That's probably enough to be going on with. Yeah.
Plenty to be going on with. Yeah, definitely. Lots of stuff to play with there.
By the way, it's spelled apostrophe PATA, physics. The apostrophe at the beginning excludes the word from the dictionary because there are no words that begin with an apostrophe. So there you are, straight away. That tells you the territory you're in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it was definitely went places I didn't entirely expect, which I suppose I kind of expected. Really, really fascinating. And actually, I'm exerting an awful lot of self-discipline to wrap this up right now, because I'd very much like to continue this conversation in all sorts of ways, and I hope for you in the audience that's been similar. But yeah, thank you so much for today.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for watching as well. It really is great to have the audience, and it's your support that really makes it possible and gives me an excuse to talk to such interesting people. So please do share this if it's raised any questions for you, if you're interested, and do get in touch with either of us if you do have any questions. You can see recordings of other episodes on the YouTube channel, and you can find Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform if you search for Delightful Dissent. The next episode is going to be in a few weeks' time, because we're going to take a quick break from recordings of Delightful Dissent as it moves to its new home in Divergent Pathfinders in this new community. So you can check out divergentpathfinders.com as it grows. And we've got some brilliant guests lined up, really, really interesting stuff, and some other new content coming soon. So please do check that out. But yeah, in the meantime, do ask, get in touch with me, write any questions. Do check out all of the amazing stuff that Andrew mentioned, because I'm definitely going to be following up on some of this. His book is yet to arrive, but I've ordered it, and I'm really looking forward to it, because it sounds right up my street, and I'm really interested to see it. But yeah, in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own, and goodbye.